Welcome to the second instalment of Conversations at QYO. Today I have with me John Rotar, the composer in residence with QYO for 2021. John has had a long association with QYO, having played in our ensembles, composed works for QYO, and I'm delighted to announce that in a few weeks' time on the 30th of May, we will be performing his first symphony, which will be the world premiere of this important new Australian symphony. John, welcome to Conversations at QYO.
Thank you for having me.
As we've gotten to know each other, it's become obvious to me that you grew up in a very musical family. Can you tell us a little bit about some of your earliest musical memories?
Yeah, so I always had music around me as a kid. Both my parents are musicians and music teachers in Bundaberg. They also both went through the QYO system, and so it's kind of interesting as I'm a second generation QYOer. But yeah, I started on piano was my first instrument, so I started that at about 6. And it was sort of just a fun thing to do. I never really regarded music as a particularly serious thing. I thought it was just something fun, and I enjoyed the social aspect of music as well when I started learning double bass and cello and trombone in school.
So you have learned a lot of instruments over the years, but can I try and rewind even further? You know, long before you perhaps started taking formal lessons on the piano, do you have any very early memories of just music as a young child? If your parents were musicians, there must have been musical instruments lying around the home, manuscript paper, music on the piano. You know, did you have any of those early associations, early memories?
Yeah, totally. I think as kids we used to have, we would always have music playing. My dad is a big fan of waking us up with a loud Mahler or Shostakovich symphony. And we would, as kids, construct little stories around music. I think that is my first thing that I really actively remember participating with music and thinking about music, because it was, we'd make up stories of there being, a giant or lions, or find animals in stories in the music. And I think I've always had that connection with music as a sort of quite communicative and quite a storytelling medium. Now I think, the story doesn't need to be concrete or have an actual narrative, but I think I still very much have a relationship to music which is quite communicative.
Right, and for you, music always had that association of there was an emotional connection to it. There was
definitely.
As a young person, you constructed stories when you heard these symphonies that your dad was playing at 6 a.m. in the morning. While some kids might be watching Transformer cartoons, you were listening to Mahler and imagining rampaging elephants.
Yeah,
or something.
totally. And I think also, I always was drawn to be quite creative. As a kid, I was always drawing pictures, or I made up my own language when I was a kid, and I would always be writing little stories and myths.
So your own language, you actually notated your own language?
Yeah, I had this, I think maybe Tolkien had inspired this idea of making up my own language, but yes,
Is this something you developed with your brother and sister?
No, I just
spoke to yourself.
I just did it myself mainly. I sort of tried to teach them, but was definitely not from a place of collaboration. It was I have made this and I'm going to talk to you in this strange gibberish, and they would go, what are you on about? But
not interested.
I was always, and I think that links into storytelling with music. I was always, even from the beginning, engaging with music, I think, in a creative way as well. I think even when I was early starting piano, I would immediately take a piece and change a note here or there. I remember performing a piece at Bundaberg Stedford, and it was I think it was called Spot the Dog, and it was a piece about a little dog, and I thought, it's a little dog, I'm going to take it up an octave. And they're like, why did you do that? And I was like, of course, you should do.
Do you think we've come too far the other way, that we sometimes are a little bit too cautious about our attitude to performing the works of other composers?
There certainly is a bit of the cult of the score. It's still a very strong thing. And I always think that music is a living thing. There is in the performance where we're doing Rachmaninoff, the bells, and my symphony, Rachmaninoff is not dead. It's no more in the past than my piece. It is happening now. Music is a happening thing. And as a composer, that's quite scary in a way that we have to compete quite literally with all these other composers, and they're still as alive and as real as they were when they were physically alive.
I'd like to go back a little bit to that point where, as a very young composer, you perhaps went from having this creative relationship to sounds and the things that you were hearing at home, to the point where you perhaps started writing music down yourself, creating your own scores. What was the very first piece that you wrote down?
Well, I remember it quite clearly. It was a terrible little piano piece. I called it Leviathan.
Leviathan.
Yes, which is just a made-up word because
from your own private language.
It was. It roughly means like to dance.
Okay.
And it was a little waltz thing, and even then,
how old would you have been?
I was about 7 or 8 when I wrote that. I remember because I remember going to my piano teacher with pieces that I'd altered, and she was like, "Just write your own music." It never had occurred to me that you were kind of allowed to write your own music. And immediately when I made that realization, I went, oh, well, I'm going to write my own music. We had plenty of manuscript paper lying around the house. My dad also writes music, so you knew that you could write down music, but...
And can I ask, did you actually consciously, at the piano, work out the notes you wanted and then write accurately those notes on the manuscript?
Yeah, I did. It was a little strange, and it was mostly just this G major waltz, but occasionally then it would be going, and then in some strange direction I would just play some black notes randomly.
But you had the ability to then notate those random black notes? You didn't just sort of do a scrawl at the bottom of the page?
Yeah, I certainly had experimented in graphic design on notation paper before that, but I think this was the first piece where I consciously knew.
You attempted to notate accurately the sounds that you were hearing.
Exactly.
And when was the moment where you thought to yourself, this is so much fun, I want to do this all the time. I want to do this as a grown-up, as it were.
Well, it sort of gradually became something that I would become more and more obsessive about doing. I think one of the turning points, I would show my dad these pieces, and he was very good with helping me he would teach me about counterpoint and harmony, but he also had a great score library. And I remember going, I want to be a composer. And he went, okay, and gave me scores of Rimsky-Korsakov, Scheherazade, Debussy Le Maire, Bartók Concerto for Orchestra, and Rite of Spring.
When you decided, I love this so much, I want to do it all the time, what was your motivation? When you really have to think about, what is my motivation to compose? Is there something that you can articulate, or is it just something deeper, an energy that you just can't keep down?
Yeah, I think it was just, at first it was an extension of what I would generally do creatively, my drawings, my little stories I'd make up. But it just became something that I was more and more excited by. I think I respond quite strongly to music in a way that I feel almost more emotional. My reaction to music is almost more emotional than I think I feel in any other part of my life. And so writing music both became this creative act and something which I really felt this deep attachment to.
So it's just a strong sense of incredible satisfaction and emotional purpose when you hear a piece of yours played or performed.
It is crazy to have a work like this symphony that we're doing, that QYS is playing. It's quite humbling to hear an orchestra of all these extremely talented players all coming together to create one thing, and when that one thing is just something that was from my head, sort of birthed from my imagination, that's quite a humbling feeling, and it's quite nerve-wracking in a way.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about QYO, because you hinted before not just you, but your family has a long association with
Yes.
QYO. I met your mum, Bernadette, just before the interview, and she told me how she played in the viola section of QYO in the 1980s. You're a second generation QYOer.
Yes.
When did you first hear about QYO?
Well, QYO it was pretty early in any of my formative experiences as a musician, because QYO would do the regional tours and they would often come to Bundaberg. And so I actually remember this little anecdote. I remember QYO came up on tour and they used to do a thing which I know they still do, where they get kids to come up and conduct the orchestra, which is always a bit of fun.
You were one of those kids?
And I was one of those kids, and I got
You had
called
a crack
up.
at conducting?
Yeah, I think it was grade 2 or 3 or something like that. And I got up and this is how you conduct, and I went, okay, yeah, right, I know this.
And how did it go?
It was ridiculous. I was just trying to push the orchestra in different direction. We were doing William Tell Overture, and I would just speed it up and slow it down and have this massive and do all these big sort of Bernstein gestures as I saw it. It would probably just look like a stupid kid flapping his arms.
And this was with QYO 2?
Yeah, I'm not sure if QYO 2 or the QYO Tour Orchestra, whichever used to tour, but yeah, it was...
Okay, so QYO was obviously known to you as a child long before you came to Brisbane. And when you did come to Brisbane, what was the first QYO group you played with?
So I played with WinSymp, my first year of uni.
That's
so
the Wind Symphony.
Yeah, so I'm a trombonist. That was what I started my undergrad on. Even though I always wanted to do composition, I did start on trombone. And then went to QAS and was in QAS for 5 years, I think.
Yep.
Which was, it's such an exciting ensemble to be a part of. And I, as a player and just a musician, I really sort of treasure those years as well. I think it's so exciting to be exposed to great repertoire and spend so much time with these players of your same age who are all great players.
You've also written many pieces for QYO. Before we talk about that, I'd like to play you a piece that you composed for junior strings called Tilt Train. How old were you when you wrote this piece?
Yes. Tilt Train Ride was written when I was about 12. I think I was in grade 8. I think that makes me about 12 or 13. And
can you tell us about the piece?
This was a very exciting moment. This was the first piece that was performed by an ensemble I wasn't in or wasn't a sort of a part of in some way. And so it was my first piece performed in Brisbane. My mum took the piece to Oster Reading Day, where they read through new works written by composers and for school kids. And the conductor of junior strings, Chen Yang, went, "This is a fun little piece, we'll try it with the QYO group." And they performed it about halfway through the year. I remember coming down and I was extremely nervous, excited, because I didn't know any of the performers.
No.
And that was the first time I think I really felt like a composer, because beforehand it was like, I'd written this piece, but my dad was conducting it and I was playing in it, and I was sort of involved in that level. But being on the outside and looking in, that was quite extraordinary, especially at a young age.
Let's have a listen.
Yeah.
This is Tilt Train. Okay, so that was the first minute or so of your composition Tilt Train Ride that you composed as a 13-year-old and performed there by a junior strings ensemble conducted by Chen Yang. I'd like to turn the conversation and finish up by talking about the symphony that you've composed. We will perform your first symphony on the 30th of May at QPAC, as I mentioned earlier. Something that I'm really excited to do in my first year of Director of Music is have a major world premiere of an important new symphony. Can you tell us a little bit about how long you've spent working on this symphony?
So this symphony, it actually started, it has quite a personal connection to QYO actually. As I said, I was in QYO for a number of years and therefore spent a lot of time with John Rotar. And QIS did perform quite a number of my pieces. As I was sort of alluding to earlier, the piece Quetzalcoatl and the Priestess was actually in the last concert that John conducted QIS, which was kind of special. But he had a profound influence on so many Queensland musicians, and you can see the QYO diaspora throughout almost all of the Australian symphony orchestras. And I think John was a really powerful figure in Australian music education. So when he died, after that, I sort of felt a need to musically respond. And I wrote about an 8-10 minute adagio for strings, which now forms the third movement of the symphony. So that was immediately after John passed. Then I looked at the piece and thought, this has something in it. It has some emotional depth. This could sit inside a larger piece, was what I was thinking. And early in 2020, I started writing the other movements around it. It sort of came out quite quickly. A lot of my music just sort of flows out in large chunks. So those three movements probably were mostly done within a month or so, but then you just keep on going back and tinkering with it. And I wrote the piece as sort of a personal thing, and never expected it to be performed. Having a symphony performed is a rare thing, and I sent it through to you and just saying, would you like to have a read through? I know QIS has a couple of weeks where they're not preparing for a concert. Would you be able to have a read through of this? And when you got back and said, we'd like to perform this piece, it was unreal.
I mean, for me, there were several stages to the process because I remember looking at the symphony. We were preparing for a concerto program at the time where we were performing Strauss's Horn Concerto and Mozart's Bassoon Concerto. You sent through the symphony, and I remember looking at the fourth movement and thinking, wow, this would be a great piece for QAS to play. And then I was also amused at the fact that in forming that program, Strauss wrote his Horn Concerto at the age of 18. Mozart wrote his Bassoon Concerto also at a very young age. I think he was 19 or 20. And I was amused by the fact that the John Rotar Symphony you would be the oldest composer on the program. And so I programmed that fourth movement as a work by a young composer to go alongside the concertos. In rehearsing it and in the performance, we had such positive feedback from the orchestra, also from the audience on the live stream, that I thought, well, I had been looking for a major new work to program in my first year, and I thought, let's do the whole symphony. So I'd like us to listen to the conclusion of the fourth movement of the symphony, and then I'd like to encourage everybody to come along to our concert on the 30th of May. Let's have a listen to the conclusion of the fourth movement of John Rotar's First Symphony. That was the conclusion of the first symphony by John Rotar, the fourth movement, performed by the Queensland Youth Symphony and conducted by myself at the Old Museum last year. I can tell you it is an incredibly exciting piece to play and to conduct, and I know that the listeners will enjoy it too. So I'd urge everybody to come along to our concert on the 30th of May, and I'd like to thank you, John Rotar, for your conversation this morning.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.